Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Sarah.
I'll tell you what, I am so fascinated by Class Action, this podcast, because we don't know how these lawyers are trained. And in fact, what I'm learning here is that these competitions that you report on are shaping the whole generation of leaders in the future.
Yeah, it's kind of wild, right?
There's a side of my creative imagination that would like to participate with this because it's like, wow, a competition to prove, your point of view.
I was going to say, but don't you do that day in, day out?
Yes.
Aren't you being the king of persuasion when you try to convince somebody that they got to be able to listen to this, or when you go home and you want to make sure that you eat that particular thing for dinner, you use your skills of persuasion. And it's amazing how that means that something like this podcast, Class Action, you don't have to be a lawyer to
Right.
listen. You don't have to be a lawyer to be interested. You don't have to feel like this is a very kind of nuanced niche kind of podcast, because it's not. It actually has universal application no matter who you are. So it's
I'm
a really cool thing to listen to.
I'm so glad that you brought that up because so many times when I'm invited to speak to these broadcasting classes, I always tell them you will be more powerful than a Baptist preacher. And they look at me kind of strange. I say you will convince people to buy a car. They will change their life because they're going to go out and eat dinner at a restaurant you spoke about. The power of talking, and people don't understand what inflection does to another human being.
Absolutely. And that is why to be able to see, listen, and get so heavily invested emotionally in the evolution of these students as they are competitors, and they are law school students, they are undergraduate students, you get invested in their coaches. In their teachers, and you find out their backstories. So it's not just how do they become good trial lawyers, but there's the why. Why did they want to do it? And that's why you get kind of that Wizard of Oz vibe. It's the let's pull the curtains back, let's see how that sausage is made, and let's care. Let's care about the fact that we have a judicial system that's not going to go away. It
Let's
is so hugely part of our lives, right? Day in, day out. And that's why it's nice to know that there's the next gen of lawyers or lawyers to be that care enough about wanting to be the best of the best so that they can give you the best of the best.
Speaking of that next layer of lawyers and things, I mean, this Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial, to me, changed everything because there's going to be a lot more of those Hollywood trials taking place, and somebody better go in there and represent better than what the opposite did.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I'm dating myself a little bit here, right? But as we know, going as far back as the O.J. Simpson trial,
Yeah.
right? This idea of bringing cameras into a courtroom to be able to experience the drama, the real life drama of a trial. Um, you saw the quality and the caliber of the lawyers back then. And now, since then, we've had so many trials that we've had cameras in the courtrooms. And the most recent one, as you've given an example, is the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial. And not to Monday morning quarterback, but I would agree with you, right? There seemed to be a disparity between the quality and the caliber of the lawyering. And whether that ended up being the deal breaker or whether or not that ended up being the issue at the end of the day with the jury, we will never know. But it makes a difference. You as a litigant, you want the best damn lawyer you can get, especially if you're going to trial, right? And so that's why you want to make sure that you have a lawyer that learned how to do it the right way from day one.
Yeah, but this what I learned during that Johnny Depp trial, and because I was there every day, I had to have it, and I think that's the reason why I love Class Action because it's now teaching me even more about that courtroom. But do they start hiring the pretty people? And the reason why I bring that up is because Richard Nixon, once he appeared on television, had to start putting the makeup on.
Oh yeah, that's really funny. Nixon of all examples you're bringing up right now with the 1-6 stuff. Um, I say this without any type of satire, and I'm not saying this to be melodramatic. No pun intended. Trial is theater,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not and it's not to diminish the fact that somebody's liberty is at stake in a criminal trial, or somebody's life may be at stake in a criminal trial, or that there's millions of dollars that are at issue in a civil trial. Jurors want to be entertained. They are not psyched to be there on their jury duty. So when you're there, you have to show them in an entertaining way the facts, have them understand the law, and then you have to persuade them to find in your favor. And we know sociologically, we know studies have been done. jurors are primarily people that look and listen, right? But it's got to be the primacy recency. And so your question, do you bring in the more attractive lawyer? Well, human nature would be, right, that maybe you are more drawn to that more attractive lawyer. So there is a lot of components. I say that's the human factor part of it, right? There's the human factors that go into it. And I listen, in this podcast, Class Action, you hear about it. You hear about presentation and style, and you hear about why that makes a difference just as much as substance does.
You talked about the why. Why did somebody do this, and why are they growing within the world of law? I mean, let's talk about Tyler for a moment. Native American politician, and he became a law student. I thought you become a law student first, then a politician.
Because maybe when you see the system so damn broken, you want to fix it. I'm serious, right? Because think about the two peas in a pod kissing cousins examples, lawyers and politicians. Several politicians have been lawyers, several lawyers become politicians. Why? Because as lawyers, we say, I can't change the laws. If you want to change the laws, go talk to your legislator, right? As legislators, what do they say? Well, listen, I make the laws, but somebody's got to enforce them.
Oh my God, so true.
Right? And so they are so symbiotically, very incestuously involved. So it just makes sense that maybe if you see a broken system, you're like, I'm going to become a lawyer because I'm going to go and advocate to fix it. So it's a very fascinating thing. And that's just one great example of what you hear about when you listen to the podcast.
Speaking of advocating, there's going to be a new generation of lawyers in the way of defending women because of a decision that was made this past week. I mean, I cannot imagine how the laws are going to change, but we need leaders inside those courtrooms because the innocent people are going to be punished.
Yeah, and Arrow, to your point, the very first thing you heard after the Dobbs decision was released a few days ago was there's going to be a slew, a tsunami of litigation.
Yep.
And in order to do it, you got to bring the best to that courtroom because it will literally impact the lives of millions of American women and their children.
Yep.
And so that's why it is important. If you're going to go to law school, pay attention, learn the substantive law. But if you think that you want to be a trial lawyer, go see what it's all about. Do the mock trials, do the litigation skills programs. Think about what it takes for you to be that kind of trial lawyer, because I'll tell you, not everybody makes the cut, literally. Not everybody. Even in the boot camps and the scrimmages you hear when you're listening to this podcast, not everybody makes the cut to do this. Why? Because not everybody's cut out to be a trial lawyer.
You know what's really interesting about class action, and I really do applaud you for doing this. You actually bring lawyer coaches into the picture here. I didn't know that this even existed.
Oh yeah, the best way to learn is from somebody who's actually done it. Because it's one thing to sit in an ivory tower and talk about it. It's a whole other thing to be able to be with a person who knew what it was like to be in the trenches. And it's not just the coaches and the teachers and the graduates that come back to serve as adjunct faculty at these schools and these programs. It's people, like Ellie Honig, who is a CNN legal analyst, and Preet Bharara. And it's people like that who actually were trial lawyers and could say, these were some of the greatest trials in my career, or these were some of my greatest failures. And they say, this is where I ended up because of doing trial law. And that's why I thought it was great to be able to listen to that and to hear the anecdotes and the memories of these people, so that you as a listener could feel like, oh, wow, this is not just going to stop once they graduate from law school. It's going to keep on going.
I totally believe in the mantra, the first step is a brand new beginning, in the way that people change their lives. And I think Andy is one of those people. He comes from a hardworking first-generation American family. But this is the kind of person that is going to influence others in his community to become stronger with their voice.
Yeah, and that was so, I'm not ashamed to tell you that I was brought to tears often when I was doing this podcast, because you hear the genuine, sincere desire by these students to bring change to their respective communities. They talk about what's lacking. They talk about even what their own families have gone through. And you listen and you're like, you know what? I sit in a place of privilege maybe, or I didn't know that. And it made me think. And isn't that what we always want, Arrow? Somebody to make us think. maybe somebody to give us a second to pause and say, I didn't think about that. So that's when you listen to the podcast and you're like, I'm rooting. I'm rooting for you. I'm rooting for this person, right? I want them to do well. And then you're going to hear along the way some really shocking twists and turns. And you're like, are you for real? Like this stuff still happens this day and age. And so that's why, not to, no spoilers here, but I think you definitely want to listen to this podcast because you're going to want to say, oh my gosh, at the end of this is where they are. This is great. Or, oh my gosh, wow. So it's cool. It was really so rewarding for me to do this project.
We are in a generation of broadcasting where the podcast is now part of our relationship, not only in an office on a one-on-one basis, but it's also in the car. What I love about Class Action is that you are painting pictures. I don't have to watch, a television show to see what you're sharing. You guys, through your writing and through your production team, are painting pictures in my imagination. I see it while I'm driving.
And that is the best endorsement we could ever get, right? This idea that because of the pandemic, when people have to pivot and they sometimes go away from the traditional video documentary medium, and they do it now in a completely, different podcast medium. I mean, how cool is it to know that you can close your eyes and you can almost envision it in your mind as to how things are going down? I love that. I'm so glad to hear that. And you're right. We are such a go, go, go society these days. Not all of us have the luxury of sitting down and watching something on TV for hours.
Right.
So the idea that you can turn it on wherever you get your podcasts and listen to it is amazing. And you can kind of listen to that, episode and stay tuned for the next. It kind of reminds me of the harkening back to the olden days of the radio serials.
Yes.
Where, right? Yeah. Right, Arrow? Like you would listen to that installment and stay tuned for the next. And that's kind of what happens with these podcast episodes.
Oh my God. And what's so bizarre about it, only because I'm such a fan of podcasts, is that yes, it does bother me that I have to wait for the next episode, but it gives me something to look forward to as well.
And I also hope it gives people, like I said a few minutes ago, some time to think.
Yep.
They maybe digest what you just heard, maybe digest about what that student's journey has been like, maybe find some relatability there to your own life and your own journey. So hopefully that's happening. And listen, maybe it's not that deep for everybody, but I still think it's entertaining. So that's the gift of this podcast.
So what went through your mind as a journalist when DeAndrea Bell decided that I'm going to be president in 2040? And I actually sat there and I'm going, wait a second, 2040 is going to be here before I even know it. I need to be watching this person.
It made me feel like, listen, I have a 7-year-old daughter with whom I am constantly amazed at the level of how precocious she is and how smart she is and how they're totally different now this day and age than I ever was when I was 7 back then. But think about the challenges these kids have. And I don't mean kids in a pejorative way, but they are to me, right? I mean, I'm almost 50 and I look at these students and I think their lives are totally different. What they get exposed to is totally different than what you and I got years ago. And I look at them and I think, thank God they care, right? I'm relieved. There's that kind of funny saying we say, right? That the kids are all right, right? The kids are all right. They are, and they're going to save us. Mm-hmm. And it's going to take these types of students, these types of competitors that know that perhaps the true battleground is a courtroom. And in order to fight the right way, you have to know how to fight. You have to know what to do. And I think that this is exactly what they wanted. They wanted to learn how to do it the right way.
Being a journalist, MSNBC, it's the 2-minute story. It's you news editors and people like that constantly on your back to go get the story, and it's got to fit within their time limit. This podcast, you're on your own, or is somebody coaching you along the way saying, "No, Katie, you can only go this far."
Not at all. Oh, this was one of those long forms. Yep. And of course we edit it for time, but this is not like you say, I've got a hard out in 3 minutes, right? This was long form interviews, long form interactions. It was hours upon hours. I mean, Kevin Huffman and Lisa Gray, they followed these students. We went on this journey for a year and some change, right? So this is not something that got recorded overnight, got slapped together and said, here you go. It is, when I say it's an investment, Arrow, it is an investment. It was a journey to be able to do this. And so that's why I was lucky to be a part of this project.
I'm so glad you brought up the truth on that, because there are so many people. I love them. I love anybody who says that they want to do a podcast, but that, but they want that instant gratification, that quick victory. And it's like, well, you're not going to enjoy the process then, because the process is making sure that you put your gut into the entire project.
Yeah, and I think that's this idea of the instant gratification this day and age is something that's applied to a lot of things. But a true podcast, in my opinion, has to make that truly deep dive. Because if not, then what's the difference between you and I just sitting down in front of the internet and just cruising through headlines? Like, if you really want to know, you want somebody who's taken the time to put the hours and to log the energy into creating and developing a podcast, because you also don't want it to be meandering. Class action has a beginning, has an end, but there's a point to it, and there's a point to every episode, and you don't feel rushed when you listen to the episodes. You don't feel like there's a mad dash to the finish line. You feel like, oh wow, at the end, okay, I'm ready for the next one, but I get it. There's a reason why we focused on this particular team or this particular competition for that episode.
Now, what did you learn from these students that are getting to the soul of the story? Because they're going to ask the right questions. They're even going to ask the wrong questions. But as a journalist, you're going to go, whoa, I've done that. Oh my God, look how it paid off for them or didn't pay off in that mock trial.
Yeah, as somebody who did the mock trials myself, as somebody who was a trial lawyer, but is now a journalist, for me, it was reaffirming that I was trained the right way when I went through it a long, long time ago. It was also reaffirming to me that I continued to do it the right way when I was a trial lawyer. But it was so curious to me how differently things are done, sometimes even geographically, right? Because you have to cater your presentation to your audience. What's that saying? Know your audience. As a journalist, I have to know my audience, right? And so these competitors learned a very hard lesson of know your audience, because South Dakota is not California, is not Florida, is not New York. So this idea of how differently things are done or what people are focusing on was a gentle reminder to me that this is a very vast, very diverse United States, and that things are not the same. We're not cookie cutter. And, to extrapolate and to be a little bit, kind of bigger visioned on this, it also was a reminder to me there's a reason why we have so much political strife right now, because we're not all cut from the same cloth. We're all coming from different places. And so it was a nice reminder that as a journalist, right, that has a national, if not larger reach for my program and for my show, et cetera, that you kind of have to be humble about the fact that we're not the same and we're not coming from the same place.
One of the things that I learned on Class Action, and it's just one of those things where I study it as a broadcaster, and that is, as broadcasters, we don't get to see the people that we're actually reaching, but in that courtroom, you're proving here that those 9 jurors, they get to see who's listening.
Yes, and that's what we all miss, because the pandemic has really curtailed the idea of this literally in person, in your face, within a few feet experience, which is why when you listen to the podcast, you have an empathy for these competitors, for these students. They had to learn a totally different, pivot on its head kind of way of trying cases, because so much was done virtually and continues to be done virtually. And frankly, Arrow, a huge portion of the future of the law will be Zoom or virtual. Yep. And so they've had to learn. And you know what? The teachers have had to learn. The coaches have had to learn. Most of these coaches are obviously older. And so they had that experience of being in court. So they've had to say, you know what? I'm going to teach it differently. So what does that look like? And that's what you hear and you learn when you're going through the podcast of Class Action. You're like, okay, this is a new frontier. This is something totally new. How do we handle this?
Oh my God, you bring up the Zoom. And it's like right away I have visions of this insurrection hearings that we're going through, and there's so much of that's on Zoom. Katie, you've got to come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you.
Oh my gosh, what an honor. Thank you so much for even the luxury of this time. I'm really flattered, and I appreciate you letting me start my week like this. This is great.
Well, you be brilliant today, okay?
I will try.
Okay. Bye.
Bye, Arrow.